Under a sky the color of cold iron, the rain fell in a slow silver curtain, soft enough to hear the creak of the saloon sign and the hollow clap of shutters against warped window frames. The street had been dust that morning, pale and dry as flour, but now it was turning into dark clay, swallowing boot heels and wagon wheels in its greedy weight. Tin roofs shone wet, and water trickled down the sides of the church's clabbered walls in crooked lines. Even the bell, when it rang, sounded far away as though muffled by the heavy air. A wagon stood at the far end of the street, its bed piled with a sagging mattress, a wooden crate of dishes and a patched trunk. Beside it, a woman in a rain-darkened dress gripped the hand of a boy who couldn't have seen more than 9 summers. His small shoulders hunched under the weight of a threadbare coat 2 sizes too large, the hem dragging through the mud. She was taller than the women who peered from doorways, though the droop of her shoulders made her seem smaller. Her hair, pinned hastily beneath a faded kerchief, had loosened in the damp, stray strands clinging to her cheeks. The landlord stood on the porch of a cabin freshly claimed by another man's rent. His voice was sharp enough to be heard through the rain. "I gave you 2 weeks past the due date, ma'am. There's nothing more I can do. Times are hard for everyone." He nodded toward the street as if the water pooling there might wash away her protest. She said nothing, only adjusted her grip on the boy's hand. Her free hand hovered over the mattress in the wagon as though she might pull it over them for shelter, but she let it drop. Her fingers were reddened from the cold. 2 women under the awning of the mercantile leaned close, lips moving behind gloved hands. One's eyes were fixed on the hem of the widow's skirt, where mud and frayed threads whispered a story no one in town needed to hear twice. A man on horseback sat his bay gelding in the shadow of the livery stable, rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto the oiled leather of his coat. His face was still, eyes steady, as he watched the small procession of belongings and heartbreak laid bare in the street. The horse shifted under him, but he didn't move forward. He just watched, as though deciding whether to step into someone else's ruin. The boy bent to pick up a worn Bible that had fallen from the crate into the mud. The gold leaf on the cover had faded, but the initials, JRH, were still visible. He wiped it with his sleeve, leaving a darker patch on the fabric. When he looked up, the man on horseback was still watching. The landlord retreated inside, the door closing with a sound too final for just wood on wood. The woman lifted the crate, wincing as her back caught with the effort. The boy tried to help, his small hands gripping the side until the weight pulled him into the mud. The horseman swung down without hurry, boots sinking into the soft street. He was broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who carried himself as though silence was a habit. He reached the boy first, steadying him with one hand, and lifted the crate with the other. The boy's eyes met his briefly, searching for something, permission perhaps to hand over his only usefulness in that moment. Their mother straightened, her breath visible in the cool air. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, roughened at the edges. He nodded, shifting the crate into the wagon bed. "Rain's not letting up soon," he said. A wagon rattled past, splashing muddy water up onto her skirts. She stepped back quickly, instinctively pulling the boy behind her, and the moment between them broke. He stepped away, returning to the gelding's side, one hand on the reins. They moved toward the overhang of the general store, where the eaves offered a narrow band of dry ground. The boy leaned into her side, shivering despite the coat. She smoothed his hair under the kerchief, her fingers brushing the shell of his ear. Across the street, the horseman still watched. His jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat, it looked as if he might cross over again. But a man in a brown coat hailed him from the livery doorway, drawing his attention. By the time he looked back, the widow was staring at the muddy street as though memorizing the way it swallowed her boots. The rain deepened, blurring the edges of buildings and the lines of faces in doorways. A stray dog padded into the street, nose low to the ground. It paused at the boy's feet, sniffed, and wagged its tail. He bent to pat it, smiling faintly. "You've a place to go?" The voice came from beside her, and she startled to find the horseman standing there again, reins looped loosely in one hand. She glanced toward the mercantile porch, where the 2 women had turned to look. "We'll manage," she said. His gaze flicked to the sagging mattress in the wagon bed. "Barn's dry. Stove's lit. You'd be welcome, till the rain eases." The boy looked up at her, hope quick as a candle flame in his eyes. She looked away from both of them. "Folk would talk." "They'll talk anyhow," he said. The boy's cough came sharp and sudden in the cold air, and her resolve wavered. She pressed a hand to his back, feeling the rattle of it through his coat. The man shifted his weight, glancing toward the sky as if to measure how long before the next downpour. "It's 3 miles to my place." Wagon could be left here. I'll send for it. Her silence stretched long enough for the dog to shake itself and trot off down the street. Finally she nodded once. He helped them onto the gelding, the boy in front of her. The horse's warmth seeped through the damp of her skirt. The man walked beside them, one hand steady on the reins. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and the lingering musk of animals long since moved out for the winter. Lantern light threw warm shadows across the walls, the rain's patter now just a distant murmur on the roof. He set a tin pot near the small stove, steam soon curling from its spout. She laid the boy down on a folded saddle blanket, tucking her shawl over him. He sighed, already drifting toward sleep. Her own bones ached from the ride, but she stayed standing, arms folded. "You can use the loft if you'd rather," he said. "More privacy." "This is fine." She looked toward the door, where water dripped from the latch to the packed earth. He followed her gaze. "Won't hold you here," he said. "But the night's long and cold." She opened her palm to reveal the locket. The brass was worn to copper at the edges, the chain frayed. Inside was a lock of dark hair, pressed flat. He wore himself out working this land. Died with nothing to show for it but that Bible. The man nodded once, eyes lowering to the damp boards beneath their feet. "I knew him," he said quietly. "Cattle drive near the Brazos years back." Her fingers tightened around the locket. "Then you know we don't take charity." "Then call it shelter," he said. The boy stirred in his sleep, coughing again. She brushed his hair back from his forehead. The man poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the edge of the feed bin near her elbow. Neither spoke for a while. The stove's heat seeped slowly into the air, chasing the damp from their clothes. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing the faint smell of wet earth through the cracks in the wall. When the boy woke, he found the sheepdog sitting by his blanket. He smiled, reaching out a hand, and the dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing. The man watched from across the barn, leaning on a stall post. "She don't take to many folk," he said. The boy grinned. "She likes me." His mother managed a small smile, her first since the rain began. She met the man's eyes briefly, then looked away. The sound of boots on wet earth broke the quiet. A man from the feed store stepped inside without knocking, a sack over his shoulder. His gaze slid from the woman to the man, and then down to the boy curled on the blanket. "Didn't figure you for the rescuing type," he said, voice carrying just enough for the woman to hear. The man said nothing, just nodded toward the corner where the feed should be left. The visitor lingered a moment longer, smirk in place, before stepping back into the rain. She stood, drawing her shawl tighter. "We should go before folk decide what they think they know." The man shook his head. "Storm's not done. And it'll be colder before dawn." Her lips pressed together, the line of her jaw tight. She looked down at her son, who was tracing circles on the dog's fur with one small finger. The stove popped as a log settled. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the barn doors. The man's voice was quiet when he spoke again. "Spare room in the house. Better for the boy's cough." She hesitated, but the sound of that cough, thin, rasping, tipped the scale. She nodded. He lifted the boy, blanket and all, into his arms. The boy's head fell against his shoulder without protest. She followed them toward the house, her boots leaving dark prints on the porch boards. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine resin and coffee. The lamplight was low, warm against the dark wood of the walls. He set the boy down on a narrow bed, pulling the quilt over him. She lingered at the doorway, fingers gripping the frame. "We won't stay long," she said. He only nodded, adjusting the quilt once more. From somewhere in the house came the faint tick of a clock, steady against the hush. The boy's breathing evened out. She looked at the man's broad back, the slope of his shoulders under the worn shirt. He turned then, meeting her eyes with something unreadable but steady. The rain was still falling, soft against the roof. "It's 3 miles to town," he said. "Too far for whispers to carry in this weather." She almost smiled, but it caught in her throat. He stepped past her, leaving her in the doorway. In the quiet, she touched the locket again, her thumb resting on the worn brass. The warmth from the room wrapped around her, but her boots still felt heavy with mud. From the bed, the boy murmured something in his sleep. She didn't catch the words, but the sound pulled her a step inside. The lamp on the table flickered, and the smell of rain drifted in through the open window. She glanced toward it, half expecting to see the street again, the mud and the whispers. Instead, she saw only the dark shape of the barn, and a faint glow where the stove still burned. It was not safety, not yet, but it was shelter. And for the first time since the landlord's door had closed behind her, she let herself breathe. The house was warmer than she expected, but not soft. The heat came from a small black stove in the corner, its surface mottled with old scratches, the iron legs sunk deep into a square of stone. The walls were bare plank, the kind that still breathed resin when the air turned damp. The table near the window was worn smooth in the middle from years of hands resting there, but the edges still bit a little into the skin. This was a house built for work, not for company. He set a tin cup of coffee in front of her before taking his own seat across the table. His eyes didn't stay on her. They moved between the cup in his hands and the rain streaking down the glass. He'd taken off his coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. Without it, the breadth of him was more plain, his shoulders filling the space between chair and wall. "You'll have the small room at the back," he said, voice steady but low. "It locks from the inside." She took a sip of the coffee, the heat of it landing hard in her chest. "We won't trouble you long," she said. His eyes flicked to hers, then away. "Storm's not letting up. No sense having the boy breathe that damp air." From the next room came the sound of a faint cough, then the creak of the bed frame. She set the cup down. "He's strong," she said, though she felt the lie in her own mouth. He leaned back, one arm resting over the chair's top rung. "Strong's no use if he takes sick in weather like this." Silence settled between them, the kind that didn't feel like an argument but also wasn't easy. Outside, the wind caught the side of the house, making the boards groan. She wrapped her hands around the coffee, letting the heat soak into her fingers. She'd been cold for so many weeks now she'd almost forgotten what it was to have warmth in her bones. Yet her shoulders stayed tight as though ready to flinch. From his chair, he studied her in the quiet, his gaze catching on the frayed edge of her sleeve where it had worn through to the lining. "You sew?" he asked. "When there's something to mend." He nodded toward a pile of shirts folded on a side table. "Buttons on those VE been missing near 2 winters. You're welcome to the work if it'd suit you." She looked at the stack but didn't answer. Work meant staying. Staying meant being seen here. And in a town where stories traveled faster than rainwater down the street, being seen was a dangerous thing. The boy coughed again. She rose without thinking, moving to the doorway of the small back room. He was curled under the quilt, the sheepdog from the barn lying at his feet. Her lips pressed into the faintest smile. "You followed us," she murmured to the dog, who thumped her tail once against the bedpost. She pulled the quilt higher over her son's shoulders, then stepped back into the main room. He was still at the table, turning his coffee cup in slow circles against the wood. "Dog's yours?" she asked. "Belongs where she chooses," he said. "She's not been wrong yet." There was a knock on the door then, 2 quick raps followed by the scrape of boots on the porch. He didn't look surprised. Rising, he opened it to reveal a man in a weather-dark coat, a burlap sack slung over one shoulder. "Brought the feed you ordered," the man said. His eyes slid past the rancher to her. They lingered a beat too long. "Didn't know you had company." The rancher's tone didn't change. "Leave it in the shed." The man's smirk was slow, practiced. "Sure. Just saying folks might be curious is all. Rain like this you can't hide much." "Feed goes in the shed," the rancher repeated. His voice wasn't louder but it carried something final in it. The man gave a short laugh through his nose and stepped back into the rain. She stood near the stove, her shawl drawn tight. "That's what I meant," she said quietly. He shut the door. "Doesn't matter what they say. It matters if it costs you standing in this town." "Standing's worth less than keeping the boy from a fever," he said, moving to refill his coffee. She turned to the window. The rain had softened to a fine mist, the kind that made the air feel thicker without falling hard enough to notice on your skin. In the distance, the hills were a wash of gray, the edges blurred into the sky. He crossed the room to place a folded towel on the back of a chair. "If you've clothes need drying, leave them there." Her instinct was to refuse. Too much kindness in one day felt like more than she could afford to accept. But the weight of her skirt was pulling at her hips, and the cold had crept up from the hem to her spine. She nodded once without meeting his eyes. Through the evening, she found herself moving carefully, as if unsure how sound traveled in this house. She heated broth on the stove, its steam curling around the edge of the pot. He worked at the table, mending a piece of tack with slow, sure motions. The only conversation came in fragments. "More wood for the stove?" "Yes, thank you." When she set the bowl in front of him, he glanced up. "You eat?" She shook her head. "Later." But he slid the bowl back toward her, his gaze holding hers until she took the seat opposite and picked up the spoon. She ate slowly, aware of the warmth spreading through her stomach, the way her fingers loosened around the handle. The boy woke near nightfall, pale and flushed at once. She brought him to the table, and the rancher poured warm milk into a tin cup. The boy's eyelids drooped after a few sips, but he stayed upright long enough to stroke the sheepdog's head. The rancher watched the child's hand move over the fur, his own expression unreadable. "What's his name?" "Thomas," she said softly. He nodded. "Strong name." They sat in the fading light, the sound of the wind easing as night settled in. She thought of how far they were from town now, how many boots would carry whispers down that main street before morning. She should have been thinking of where to go next. Instead, she was watching her son's breathing slow, his head resting against her arm. Later, when she stepped outside to empty the basin, the air bit colder, the rain little more than a damp breath on her face. She stood on the porch, staring at the dark shape of the barn. A light still glowed inside, faint through the cracks in the wall. He joined her after a moment, pulling the door closed behind him. "Weather'll hold a few more days," he said. She tightened her shawl. "Then we'll be gone." He looked toward the hills where the clouds were still low. "Storm like this can change the ground under your feet before you know it." Her eyes followed his to the road, now just a darker line between fields. She wondered if he meant the mud or something else. When they went back inside, he took the extra quilt from the trunk by the wall and laid it on the bed in the small room. She didn't thank him, but she smoothed her hand over the stitching before tucking it around her son. In the deep of the night, she woke to the sound of the wind rattling the shutters. She rose quietly, stepping to the doorway. The lamp in the main room was still lit, casting a low amber glow. He was at the table, head bowed over the Bible her son had carried from the wagon. His thumb moved over the initials on the cover. She stood in the shadow, watching the way his brow furrowed, the way his jaw tightened like he was holding something back. Without looking up, he spoke. "Knew a man by those letters. We drove cattle together once. He could read the stars better than any trail hand I ever met." Her breath caught. "That was my husband." He looked up then, meeting her gaze in the dim light. He spoke of a boy not yet walking. Said he hoped to teach him to rope by the time he was 6. She glanced toward the bed where her son lay. He never got the chance. The silence that followed was heavier than before, but not sharp. More like the weight of something set down between them. He closed the Bible and set it on the table. "You'll have what shelter I can give," he said. "No one's business but ours." She stepped back into the small room, her hand on the doorframe, the quilt waiting on the bed. For the first time in months, she let herself believe they might make it through the week without losing more than they'd already lost. But as she lay down, she heard the faint sound of boots in the yard, too light to be his, too careful to be passing by. Somewhere beyond the wall, a shadow moved. Her son stirred beside her. She kept her hand on his back until his breathing smoothed again, but her eyes stayed open, fixed on the dark. The storm had not yet passed, and neither had the watching WY the third morning. The rain had thinned to a gray mist, more like breath on glass than weather meant to break a man's day. The yard smelled of wet wood and earth, the kind that clings to boots until it feels like you're walking with the land itself tied to your heels. She stood on the porch with a tin basin of laundry, her shawl pinned tight at her throat, watching the hills disappear and reappear in the shifting light. Inside, the boy sat cross-legged on the floor with a length of twine, knotting it into shapes the sheepdog watched with polite disinterest. The rancher was at the table, sharpening a blade in slow, even pulls, each scrape soft as paper tearing. He glanced toward her now and then, though never for long enough to make her feel cornered. The quiet between them had changed since that night with the Bible. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It had weight, a kind that settled rather than pressed. She wasn't sure if that made it safer or more dangerous. After breakfast, biscuits left over from the day before and coffee strong enough to steady her knees, she followed him out to the fence line. The boy trailed behind, dragging a stick through the mud, drawing crooked shapes that vanished as quickly as they were made. The fence was leaning in one stretch, the rails warped from seasons of weather. He set to work replacing a post, the axe in his hands moving with the precision of someone who had learned long ago to conserve his strength. She gathered fallen rails without being asked, stacking them neat against the fence. The boy carried the smallest pieces, proud in the way children are when their work looks like someone else's. When the last rail was set, the rancher stood back, wiping rain from his brow. "That'll hold for a spell," he said. She nodded. "Until the ground shifts again." His mouth tilted, something that might have been a smile if it had lasted longer. Everything shifts sooner or later. They walked back to the house, the boy racing ahead to greet the dog. On the porch, she caught her reflection faint in the window, hair damp at the edges, cheeks carrying more color than they had last week. It startled her. By midday, the mist had burned off enough for sunlight to pool faintly in the yard. She mended one of his shirts at the table, her needle moving through the worn fabric. He worked beside her, cutting strips of leather for reins. The quiet was companionable, broken only by the sound of the boy's soft humming from the floor. When she finished the shirt, she folded it carefully, smoothing the seams. He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. "Didn't think I'd see the day," he said, nodding toward the mended buttons. "Buttons hold longer than most promises," she said. His gaze lingered a fraction longer than it should have before he set the shirt aside. In the afternoon, a shadow fell across the doorway. A woman stood there, her dress neat, bonnet tied just so. The lines at the corners of her mouth were deep, not from smiling. "Afternoon," the woman said. Her eyes moved past the rancher to where the widow Saturday. "I thought I'd bring word. The church elders have been asking after you." "After me?" the widow said slowly. The woman's lips pursed. "This is a small town. Folk notice when strangers settle in unexpected places." The rancher's posture didn't change, but the air between them cooled. "She's a guest," he said. The woman's gaze shifted to him. "Guests don't stay through 3 sunsets without someone wondering whose roof they're under." She looked back at the widow. "It's not my place to tell you what's proper, but it's my place to warn you that others will." The widow held her eyes steady. "Thank you for the warning." The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line before she turned and left, her boots clicking against the porch boards in a rhythm that felt like judgment. When the door closed, the boy looked up from the floor, his brow furrowed. "Did we do something wrong?" "No," his mother said. The rancher's voice was even. "Some folks decide wrong before they see the truth of a thing." Still, the words lodged in her like grit in the skin. That night, after the boy was asleep, she sat on the porch steps, the cool air wrapping around her shoulders. She thought about the woman's face, the careful way she'd stood just outside the door, as if proximity alone could stain her. The rancher came out carrying 2 mugs. He set one beside her and sat on the other step. "You thinking of leaving?" he asked without looking at her. She didn't answer at first. The yard was quiet, save for the rustle of the wind in the dry grass. "It would make things easier for you," she said finally. He took a slow sip. "Easier isn't always better." Her hand tightened around the mug. "I won't be the cause of you losing standing here." He let the thought hang, neither agreeing nor denying it. "If you go, I won't stop you," he said after a while. The words were simple, but they left her chest hollow. She nodded once, more to herself than to him, and stood. Best get some rest. Sleep didn't come easily. She packed the boy's spare clothes into a bundle before dawn, folding each piece with the care of someone tucking away a life. He stirred but didn't wake as she eased the quilt over him again. By first light, she was in the yard, tying the bundle to her shoulder. The grass was wet, the tips catching the pale sun. The air had that clean smell that comes after days of rain, but it carried the faint chill of something about to turn. She glanced toward the barn. The dog was lying in the doorway, head on her paws, watching her without moving. Inside the house, the floor creaked, his steps steady and unhurried. She turned before he could see her go, taking the path toward the road. The boy caught up to her at the fence, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mama? Where are we going?" "Somewhere we won't trouble anyone," she said, though the words sounded thinner than she meant. He took her hand without argument. They walked past the last fence post, the land opening wide around them. The sun was rising over the hills, but the warmth didn't reach her. Each step felt like pressing roots into shallow soil. There was no grip, only movement away from what might have been a place to stay. She didn't hear him come up behind them until the boy stopped and turned. The rancher stood a few paces back, one hand resting on the top rail of the fence. He didn't call out. He just watched them, his face unreadable in the morning light. The boy let go of her hand and ran back, stopping just short of him. She waited, her pulse loud in her ears. He crouched to say something to the boy, too quiet for her to hear, but whatever it was made the child look down, then back toward her. When the boy returned, he was carrying something small. It was the Bible, the initials still faint under the worn cover. He held it out to her. "He said you forgot this." She took it, the leather warm from the boy's hands. The rancher had already turned back toward the house, his steps steady as before. She stood there a long time, the weight of the book more than its pages should allow. The boy tugged at her skirt, ready to walk again, but her feet stayed planted. The road ahead looked endless. The house behind was small against the horizon, yet it was the only thing that didn't blur in her vision. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the stove. She closed the Bible without opening it, tucking it into the crook of her arm. The boy looked up at her. "Mama?" Her voice felt caught in her throat, so she only squeezed his hand. They turned toward the road again, but her steps slowed, each one heavier than the last, as if the soil under her feet was deciding whether to let her go at all. The house felt larger without them, though nothing inside had changed. The table still held 3 chairs, the same chipped mug rested by the stove, the same low tick of the wall clock marked the hours. But the air was different, thin as if something had been pulled out and carried down the road with them. He sat at the table longer than his coffee needed drinking, his hands wrapped around the mug though the heat had gone. Outside, the yard was still slick from the week's rain, the fence rails dark with damp. The sheepdog waited by the porch, her head turning toward the road every few minutes. By midday the chores were done in half the time they usually took. The quiet made them shorter and heavier. When he came in for dinner, the smell of wood smoke felt flat without the sound of the boys humming in the corner or her measured footsteps moving between stove and table. He ate bread and cold beans, leaning on one elbow, staring at the empty chair across from him. The dog came to sit beside him, resting her head on his knee. He scratched behind her ears without looking down. "They won't get far on foot," he murmured. On the porch, a small shape caught his eye, a book lying just inside the rail. He bent to pick it up. The Bible's cover was slick with morning dew, the initials still faint in the leather. When he opened it, a scrap of paper slipped free. It was a drawing, done in the unsteady hand of a child. 3 figures beneath a peaked roof, a small square for a window, smoke curling from the chimney. He turned it over, but there was nothing written on the back. He looked at it for a long time before sliding it back between the pages. The afternoon passed slow. He mended a strap that didn't need mending, stacked wood that was already stacked. When the sun dropped low, he took his coat from the peg and stepped into the yard. The road to town was still soft in places, the mud grabbing at his boots. The hills ahead caught the last of the light, the grass turning the color of old brass. He kept a steady pace, the Bible under his arm, the drawing inside it pressing against the leather. The first lights of town flickered through the dusk, lamps lit in windows, the glow of the saloon spilling across the boardwalk. He kept to the quieter street, the one that curved past the boarding house. The porch there sagged a little on one side, the steps worn in the middle from years of boots. They were sitting on the top step, her bundle at her feet, the boy leaning against her side. She looked up when he stopped at the bottom. "You forgot this," he said, holding out the Bible. She didn't reach for it at first. Her eyes moved from the book to his face, searching for something in the lines there. The boy slipped off the step and came toward him, small boots thumping on the boards. He took the Bible from the man's hand, then turned and placed it in his mother's lap. "It's yours," he said. Her fingers curled around it, the leather still cool from the night air. She glanced toward the street, where a pair of men were watching from the shadows near the post office. Their heads bent together as they spoke. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I'm not here for them," he answered. The boy climbed back onto the step, tucking himself under her arm. She smoothed his hair, her eyes still on the man standing below. "And what happens when they decide what they think they know?" "They already have," he said. "It changes nothing." The boarding house door opened, spilling lamplight across the porch. A woman's voice called her name, impatient. She rose slowly, lifting the bundle, the Bible pressed against it. He didn't move aside as she came down the steps, but she walked past him without brushing his sleeve. At the edge of the porch light, she paused, her voice barely above the wind. "You don't know what it costs being on the wrong side of talk in a town like this." "I know enough," he said. For a moment she stood there, the boy's hand in hers. Then she went inside, the door closing behind her. He stayed in the street a while longer, the sound of the wind moving through the narrow gap between buildings. When he finally turned back toward home, the dog was waiting where the road left town, her shape a darker shadow against the pale dirt. They walked together, the night settling cold around them. At the house, he left the lamp low and set the Bible on the table, the drawing still inside. The empty chair across from him caught the light, its back casting a long shadow across the floorboards. He looked at it until the lamp's flame wavered. Then he reached out and pulled it closer to the table, the legs scraping softly against the wood. The wind shifted outside, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. Somewhere beyond the hills, a door had closed on her for the night. But he couldn't shake the thought that another one, this one, had been left unlocked. The morning broke clear, the kind of light that makes every board and stone seem sharper, as if the rain had scrubbed the world in the night. He sat at the table with the Bible open in front of him, the child's drawing marking the place where the pages still stuck faintly from damp. The chair across from him was empty, but the scrape he'd left on the floorboards last night kept it close, as though proximity alone could keep it from feeling abandoned. By the time he saddled the gelding, the sun was just high enough to warm the porch. The sheepdog paced at his side, pausing now and then to look down the road toward town. He didn't bother packing supplies, he wasn't riding far and he wasn't coming back without them. The main street was already alive, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, the smell of bread from the bakery mixing with the sharper tang of coal smoke. Heads turned as he passed, the murmur starting before he reached the center of town. He kept his eyes forward, his hands loose on the reins. She was there, outside the boarding house, speaking quietly to the boy as he tied his coat. Her bundle was smaller than before, as if she'd already had to trade or leave behind more than she meant to. When she saw him, her hand tightened on her son's shoulder. "We're leaving," she said before he'd even dismounted. "Not like this," he replied. "You can't change what they'll say." "I'm not here to change them," he said, stepping closer. "I'm here to make sure they know where I stand." The boy looked between them, his brow furrowed. "Mama?" He took her bundle from her hand and slung it over his own shoulder. "Come." Her eyes flashed, not with fear but with the ache of someone bracing for a cost they've paid before. But she didn't resist when he turned toward the street. The walk to the church was short, but the air seemed to tighten with every step. People slowed their errands, their gazes following. By the time they reached the wide steps, the murmur had grown into a low hum of voices. The church door stood open, the smell of beeswax and old wood drifting out. He stopped there, turning so every face in the street could see them. "This woman and her boy," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to carry, "will not sleep in the cold again. Not while I've got a roof." The words fell into the space between buildings, heavy and final. A few people shifted, their eyes sliding away. Others watched openly, their mouths set in tight lines. She stood beside him, still as a fence post, the boy's hand clutched in hers. The weight of the eyes on them was real, sharp in her spine, hot on her cheeks. But his presence at her side didn't waver, and she found herself breathing in time with him, slow and measured. He didn't look at her when he spoke next, the words meant for the whole street. "You can think what you will. You can say what you like. But she's under my protection. That's all there is." For a moment no one moved. Then the grocer went back to arranging crates, and the blacksmith ducked into his shop. The murmur thinned, but she knew the talk would travel farther now, carried on more tongues than before. Still, for the first time it didn't feel like it might crush her. He started back toward the edge of town, the bundle still on his shoulder. She followed, the boy at her side, the street parting just enough to let them through. The ride home was quiet. The air was crisp, the road drying into firm earth under the sun. She kept her gaze on the horizon, the low line of hills that marked where his land began. At the house, he set her bundle on the porch and held the door open. Inside, the air was warm from the stove, the smell of coffee lingering. The chair across from his was still there, drawn close to the table. The boy ran to the dog, who greeted him with a thump of her tail. She stood in the doorway a moment longer before stepping inside. He moved to the hearth and reached for something hanging on a nail, a small locket, the brass dulled with age. She froze when she saw it. "You left it by the bed," he said. "Things like this shouldn't be tucked away where no one can see them." He hung it above the hearth, where the light from the window caught its curve. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he turned to her. "We don't need fixing," he said simply. "Just a place to belong." The words landed deeper than she expected. She stepped forward, her eyes on the locket, the boy's soft laughter in the background. The warmth from the stove touched her face, and for the first time in months she didn't feel the need to brace against it. She looked at him, then really looked, at the quiet steadiness in his gaze, at the way he left space between them without stepping away. Outside, the wind shifted, catching the sound of the boy's voice as he called for her to come see something. She nodded once to the rancher, then moved toward her son, the floorboards warm under her feet. The chair at the table stayed close, waiting.